Three, two, one, punch it.
Could you jump to light speed in that tin can? Go back in time in a DeLorean? Will it crash or take to the sky? Tell me, smart guy, does it fly?
Welcome to Does It Fly, the podcast that puts your favorite sci-fi properties, inventions, and conceits to the test. I'm your mad scientist, Hakeem Oluseyi.
And I'm your pop culture expert, Tamara Krinsky. Time to dive into today's topic and see, does it fly? Hakeem.
My Tamara, how are you, ma'am?
I'm good.
Yes.
I've been thinking a lot about cherries this week. There's two reasons. It's cherry eating season, but also I'm listening to a book called Tom Lake by Ann Patchett.
Okay.
And it's about a family that lives on a cherry farm, but it's also about like my other area of geekdom, which is theater.
Oh.
And right. So the main character is there. It's like set kind of right in the early days of the pandemic. Her 3 adult daughters are home. And she's telling them the story of her past when she did summer stock and was an actress at one point. But the whole thing takes place in northern Michigan, so we're constantly hearing about
Is that a cherry area? A cherry producing area? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Hey, well, let me tell you about my big week.
Yeah, what happened?
I got to ride in a Rolls Royce for the first time.
What were you doing riding in a Rolls?
So I got invited to appear on a different podcast by, what is his name?
Were you cheating on me, Hakeem?
Oh, definitely never.
I'm just kidding. You should be on as many podcasts as you possibly can be. You have a lot to say.
I was a guest. So anyway, it's Billy Carson who talks about paranormal things. And he wanted me to come and talk about the physics of quantum physics and these sort of things for his audience, because in those circles, there's a lot of quantum stuff. But he sends Rolls Royce to pick me up from my hotel and take me to the recording. It's his.
What?
Yeah.
Hilarious. So how was it? Was it as you had imagined? Did it feel different? Did it?
You know what? That's the thing. In a way, yes. In a way, no. Like the headrest was incredibly impressive. I was sitting in the back seat.
Wait, what? Explain. What was it like? Cushiony? Was it just?
Yeah, it was cushiony, and it felt like I was like, oh, it sort of surprised me. So it was my second ride in the car. I'm like, oh wow, that feels really good. But otherwise, there wasn't really anything that spectacular.
Full disclosure about headrests. I never really think about them.
Yeah, exactly.
Because my head doesn't reach the headrest.
Oh no, that is not one of the seat adjustments, is it? There isn't a.
No. Oh, maybe there's a spot in the market for, instead of the headrest being like on top of the seat, I wonder if there's something you could invent where, like, if this is the top of your seat, like you could activate something to push out a little bit.
Oh,
like a pop-out headrest instead of something resting above.
Yeah, and you could do that with beds too, right? Turn it into a pillow. Internal pillows. No more external pillows. Wow.
Related question, because we both fly a lot. Do you use a pillow when you fly? And if so, do you have a favorite?
Almost never. But I tell you what happened to me on a super long flight that was like such a disaster. It had the lie flat seat, and my seat was broken in some way that I can't recall, but it made it like horribly uncomfortable.
Oh no.
Yeah.
So what'd you do?
I had to deal with it, and they were like, oh, you know what? I think I was it lie flat? No, it just had like a thing that came out or something. But basically what happened is I was like, is there a seat available in first class? Because I wasn't in first class. And they were like, no, because at first they offered that to me. I didn't ask, they offered. And they were so apologetic, but I'm just like, yo, there ain't nothing you can do about it. No need to apologize. But when I got off of that plane, I was coming from the Middle East back to the American East Coast. So it was
that's a long flight.
Yeah, it was a long flight.
Yeah.
Bummer. But anyway, speaking of discomfort.
And speaking of things flying around.
You ever been in a tornado?
Thank goodness, no. But I felt like I was in a tornado when I watched the movie that we're talking about today. I am talking, of course, about the natural disaster classic, Twister.
All right, natural disaster classic. The 60s and 70s may disagree. Isn't that the name of that game that would lead to making out? Isn't that?
Oh God, yes, that's a different Twister. I'm talking about a movie Twister.
That movie is
Different Twister.
much more fun. Well, I grew up in parts of the country that are hit by tornadoes, right? In Mississippi, it would happen a lot. And I've even seen a funnel cloud once. I've never seen a tornado touch
Whoa.
down. Yeah.
Okay.
My buddy Darren Brown again, we're out and we see this little thing descend from the cloud and it's starting and we freak out. Ah! And run home. Tornado.
Oh man.
It never touched down.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie. It's one of those things that, like, the curious part of me would love to see, as long as it was very far away.
Yeah, that's how I feel about a massive meteorite impact on Earth. It's like, oh, I'd love to see that, but then again, no. Right? Like something like Barringer Crater in Arizona, right? Not a planet killer, but
No.
yeah, meteor crater as they call it in Arizona. That one's 50,000 years ago. Imagine seeing that, just the coming through the atmosphere part and then the boom, big explosion in the distance. Woof.
Yeah, well, that is something you would definitely want a warning about, which is part of what we're going to talk about. A big part of what we're going to talk about with Twister.
For those of you, excuse me, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I tend to go on tangents. But Tamara is so good at keeping us on track, bringing me back. Like, I appreciate you. Rein me in.
Well, in this case, we're talking rain, we're talking hail, we're talking wind.
I did that on purpose.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I like the setup. That was good. And the so for those of you who may be new to Does It Fly, our podcast happens in three gentle parts, three approximate parts, where Hakeem is going to talk about the science of a device. I'm going to talk about the story part of our movie, and we'll both talk about whether these things fly, whether they work. And then our third question of Does It Fly will be, does it fly for the feels? Does it fly for the vibes? And is there maybe a larger question that the movie helps us explore?
The science of Twister, there's so much to get into. There's atmospheric science, and there is, when you say science, a lot of people, we think nature, right? Nature. But science is a thing that we do, right? And so nature's doing its thing. And what's really cool about this movie is that the scientists are doing their thing out in the field, and it's very relatable to the audience, right? You can actually see this happening. So
right. And so the thing that they're out in the field doing is they are testing a device. They are deploying a device that they've been working on called Dorothy, which is meant to collect data about what is going on inside the tornado.
In real time.
And so that's what we're going to look at today. The science of Dorothy. Does this device work? Could it work? If it did it work then, could it work in the future? And then how that factors into story. So
yes.
Tell me a little bit about Dorothy.
Yeah, a little bit about Dorothy. So the thing about Dorothy, so if you look at the movie, what you see is you have storm chasers. They are trying to put their device actually in a tornado. And by that, I don't mean, oh, there's a tornado right there. Let's walk inside of it and place our device, right? So tornadoes are a bit unpredictable, and they're trying to get their device in a location that the tornado is going to go across. And in order to increase the probability of that happening, they have to get as close to the tornado as possible. Which, if you look at it, it makes for great movie making, but a lot of it is probably something real storm chasers would never do because it's just too dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But in this case, you've got your Dorothy, which is this. It basically looks like, to me, it looks kind of almost like one of those big metal garbage cans. It's like a big, massive canister.
A barrel.
And then inside, barrel, that's a better word. And then inside are these sensors that look like little balls. And the idea is that
she opens and releases hundreds of these sensors that measure all parts of the tornado simultaneously,
which would then be transmitted and could be studied. Because at this point, at least the setup for Twister is that no one's been able to study what is happening meteorologically. I said that right?
Yeah.
Meteorologically inside the Twister. And if they could get more data, if they could understand how these form, then they could actually warn people ahead of time. And the more time you have, the safer people will be.
Absolutely. And remember now, this is 1996. It's, almost 30 years ago. So the idea of tornado warnings, tornado watches, forecasting was relatively new. It was only like a couple of decades old at that point. Now, what you're talking about gathering data can really be looked at as a general scientific principle. All the data that is possible to get, that's what you want to get. Before, after, you name it, right? Ideally, you'd have satellites. You'd have ground-based sensors. You'd have airborne sensors. So if you look at what they're doing with Dorothy, it's really from the ground up to a particular altitude, all right? So let's start off by talking about the method of deployment of their particular sensors. So what do you want to measure? You want to measure things like temperature, wind speed, humidity, the barometric pressure, and probably a bunch of other things, right? Now, here's the thing. What makes the damn balls go up into the sky? How do you make that predictable when from tornado to tornado, the conditions are going to be different? So one of the misconceptions about tornadoes, I remember when we were doing our tornado drills in schools and at home, was that they have such low pressure, which they do have lower pressure, that homes basically explode, right? It's the high pressure trapped on the inside, low pressure on the outside. So that pressure differential makes an explosion occur. And that seems similar to me to what would happen with these particular balls, right? It seems like they're saying they're sucked up into the tornado by the low pressure. But balls in a barrel in windy conditions would not fly up out of the barrel, right? The barrel would get knocked over. Most would probably stay in as it twirled around, right? So that part of the science, the whole deployment of the sensors is kind of weird, right? And we're looking at it from today's vantage point where we have drones. And so people really are doing that. They really are sending drones at least close to tornadoes and gathering data. And the other thing is that we have tiny electronic cameras that they didn't have, as prevalently in 1996. So you could
That was actually one of the fun things about watching the movie, sort of seeing where the tech was at, as they were trying to, a big part of what they were doing was, in addition to deploying Dorothy and the sensors, was also filming it so that they could then use that to get more money to continue with their research. Helen Hunt, who plays Dr. Joe Harding, who is in charge of this whole endeavor, says very early on, we are running out of money. We have 4 prototypes and we got to get one of these things to work. So they set the stakes really early. But watching the video cameras, watching stuff come in on what now seems like a very primitive laptop, that was hilarious.
Think of that sentence you just said. Primitive laptop.
I know.
You're so contemporary. You're so modern. What's the word? Space age. Remember? Anyway, let me not even get on that, but we're living in the modern world and we can even form the phrase primitive laptop because now they're so ubiquitous and just every day. Well, so all right. So you already hear me saying that the method of deployment doesn't fly. Get it? But doesn't fly. But here's the thing though. The whole idea of putting an array of sensors within a tornado funnel like that more than flies. It inspired the current era of a lot of data gathering by meteorologists out in the field. They were sort of ahead of the game in imagining this. I think the first time that somebody, maybe not the first time, because there was Toto, right? There was a barrel type field laboratory that you would place in the path of. So here's the question for you that I learned last year. If you're somewhere and you see a tornado, how do you know whether it's coming toward you or not?
Is this a trick question?
It is a trick question. I didn't know the answer until I heard it.
What's the answer?
If it looks like it's not moving, it's coming toward you.
Wait, what?
Yeah, because if it's moving left to right along your line of sight, you'll see that motion left to right. But if it's coming straight toward you, the effect pretty much is you'd see the projection, the what do you call that? The solid angle would increase as it gets closer, but you really don't notice it at first, right? You can't notice that. So it looks like it's sitting still. That means it's coming directly toward you.
Okay, good to know. Run in the other direction. Useful tips.
Useful tips. Yeah. So they attempted to set Toto in the path of tornadoes. And what ended up happening was they missed every single time. And one time they got the edge of a tornado. So they retired that. But later, he used amateur rockets to fly sensors into the storm.
Did it work?
It worked. Yeah, it worked. And nowadays they use drones, right, to deploy sensors into storms. And of course, I don't know how you would, how you fly hurricanes over, fly planes over hurricanes to get into the eye of the storm. I'm not sure. I've never heard about that with tornadoes. I don't know if that's something they do or if it's not sufficiently safe.
I mean, I did a little bit of reading just when I was, researching kind of how this was made and some of the research they did. And because the actors actually did go out with storm chasers
Yeah.
as part of the prep for the movie. And one of the things that came up in one of the articles I was reading was the fact that they talk a lot in the movie about sort of the core, or what I was thinking of as like similar to the eye of the hurricane, that spot in the middle. However, the way it's portrayed in the movie is actually not what it is like in real life. There's a lot more. Usually there's more like mini funnel. There's more funnels in there. There's usually lightning. There's a moment of calm that you see towards the end of the film when Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton are sort of looking up through the core. That would not be the case. So going back to what you were saying about like, what can you fly in there? Can you fly over it to drop down in? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a weather person here, but that seems highly unlikely.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like
Although
it
I'm
could
sure
be
someone's
dangerous.
working on figuring it
Yeah.
out.
You know what? When you mentioned that scene, I remember there was a video on the internet some years back, like almost a decade back, where a guy actually did film himself looking up in the center of a tornado. Not because he was a storm chaser, but he found himself.
Oh, like he unfortunately found himself there.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't know if it was a boop, pop out the cell phone scenario. I'm not sure. But it occurred. Someone's been in the center and survived and had the video to share.
That just shows you the age that we're in. Like, you unexpectedly get caught in a tornado. What do? Well, you take pictures of it.
Exactly.
You film it and make a video.
Otherwise, it didn't happen. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's not caught
So
on film, but was it real?
speaking of deploying the sensors, there's another spot. There's another point in the movie where they add basically fins to their little spherical devices,
Yeah, to the ground.
and to get, I don't know, a higher altitude or something. Again, I don't like the whole deployment. Like, if they had some sort of mechanism that would launch them upwards into it, and then they they can get caught up in the winds and buffeted
Right.
about, that's one thing. But just getting sucked up out of the barrel, I don't care what you put on it. That doesn't fly very well to me, unless it's something that's sticking up like a ballooning baby spider, right? It's gonna snatch it up out of there. But the whole idea of, I can make measurements in situ inside of the tornado, I can actually beam, right? Because if you think about it, how do you get the data? You can either record it on board or you can transmit it, right? And today they actually do transmit data out of the storm. So what, you might think, oh, there may be interference some sort. Does the wind form a Faraday cage? That's a joke for my nerds out there tomorrow. Only metals, conductive materials form Faraday cages for non-nerds.
There's a whole microwave thing here. I
There's
know.
a whole, right? Like the microwave holes. Why don't they come out? Okay, so yeah, so
Are they
deployment doesn't work.
multiplying?
The idea of wanting to obtain data in the tornado in situ doesn't actually benefit you scientifically for the purpose of understanding tornadoes, but also saying something about the specific tornado that you are measuring. That's all very valuable. And, you'd actually want more data, right? You want data at all altitudes, and you want it radially going outwards. But then there's also the data that's in the debris that's lifted up and thrown about. All right. I'm assuming that from tornado to tornado, they don't interact the same way with the stuff at ground level. Some may be better at, toppling trees than others. Some may be better. Have you seen the recent building that got ripped apart by the tornado? It was some stationary camera, like a Ring camera or something, across the street from the building. Oh, it is so dramatic. One moment there's big building, tornado comes through, you see it peeling away. And then when their calm resumes shortly thereafter, buildingless, like rubble, like nothingness.
So, okay, so that brings up an interesting point too that came up when I was looking into some of the research on this, right? So we're constantly hearing one of the ways they build tension throughout the movie is by the F number of the tornado. So that's basically it's a scale of F1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and that tells you how bad it is. The higher the number, the more
How bad
extreme
it
the tornado is.
was.
Well, so that's the thing.
Yeah.
So you were just talking about debris. So one of the things they take some liberty with is they see the tornado forming and they say, oh, that looks like an F3. Oh, we're in an F4. We're in an F2. And what I read about is that that's not how it works. You actually have to wait till after the tornado is over, and it's the measurement of the debris and the damage that determines if it was an F3 or an F4 and F5. Now, I mean, like anything, you could, look outside your window and be like, oh my God, this looks like a really bad storm. I bet it's going to be a blah, blah, blah. But in this case, they state it pretty definitively. Like, I'm looking, oh, it's an F5, it's an F4. And that's not exactly how it works.
Yeah, it's not exactly how it's not like hurricanes, right?
No,
But
no.
where they do that. But if they could have made it realistically, you know how they could have made it more realistic? If they were betting. Right? That makes it a future determined outcome.
Right.
Yeah, and it makes it an interesting conversation. I bet it's F4. What? You can have a tornado pool before each one, like an office pool.
Right.
Yeah, you have a tornado pool.
I don't know. I feel like some of the characters on that show probably did bet because you've got such a great supporting cast with people like Philip Seymour Hoffman and Joey Slotnick and Alan Ruck.
There you go.
So
again.
I feel like what?
You're keeping us on track and switching it over to the story. Did I get my final?
No, we can't switch over to the story yet because you have to tell me definitively.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Dorothy device in Twister flies? Does it fly?
Wait. How did you phrase that? The Dorothy device or a Dorothy-like device? Because
a Dorothy. That's a good point. Good point. A Dorothy-like device.
Yeah, because we do say it flies if it could fly at some point in the future. And I will say that Dorothy flies.
Really?
Absolutely. Dorothy flies big time. And I can't wait till section 3 where we can add some more discussion on why it flies super big time.
Right. Okay. So this is your warning, everybody. If you have not seen 1996's Twister, now would be the time to go watch it and then come back and unpress pause and continue listening. Then again, this was 1996, so I do feel like you've had a chance to see it. That said, Twisters is out in theaters this summer, so I will not say anything about that other than to say that it stars Glenn Powell and Daisy Edgar Jones and Anthony Ramos. There's a great cast, so we'll just leave it at that. No spoilers.
A question: do you typically see movies before they're released in theaters?
It honestly totally depends on what I'm working on. A lot of time if I'm covering something, whether it's for a red carpet or a press junket or something like that, they will often make it available to us just because that way we can ask informed questions. Right. A lot of times too, though, when you do that, there's what's called a press embargo, which means you're shooting it ahead of time, but you're holding it back. You're not allowed to publish a review or something like that. Well, everybody has a right to an opinion. I mean, we have a lot of opinions on this show. Like in general, for me, like as a performer, as someone who's written films and produced stuff with many, many friends in the industry, there's so much that goes into making these things. And I just never had the desire to be the one passing judgment on something.
Yeah.
I believe in good criticism. I think there are amazing film critics out there, and I respect them so much because so many of them, the good film critics have this deep understanding of film and can talk about it as an art form. And I'm very appreciative of that, but that's just not my jam. And that brings me to, if we're going to talk about story, I feel like there are 3 things we have to talk about with this movie. 1 is the special effects and the visual effects. 2 is the actors and the characters. And then 3 is a little bit about theme. So
okay, one question before you get into that. You said special effects. So is special effects an umbrella? Because before we've talked about practical effects or something like that?
So special effects versus visual effects.
Okay.
So visual effects are the effects that are done after you're done shooting. So they're done in post-production, digital effects. I mean, there's a whole variety of kinds of visual effects, but that's what's added later. Special effects usually refer to what I'll call practical effects or things that are done on practical sets. So that's what's actually done on screen while you're making it. And so Twister's origin story starts with visual effects.
Ah.
So Steven Spielberg is one of the EPs on this. Kathleen Kennedy is one of the producers. And they went to Industrial Light and Magic, which is George Lucas's company. And they came up with a challenge for them. They said, could you create a realistic looking tornado? And at this point obviously they started with Star Wars, they'd done Jurassic Park, they'd done stuff for Casper, they'd done a number of things. So clearly they were pretty accomplished. But at that point, they'd never actually created a natural disaster on screen. They'd created many things that people had never really seen before. So you weren't trying to measure up to somebody's real life experience of something, unless someone's seen a dinosaur in real life and they just haven't told us yet. But no one I know,
Right? Yeah. Same.
no one I know has really come into contact with Casper the Friendly Ghost. So they went and they did this whole piece of test footage for them, and that is what they brought to the studio before they had a script and said, "We think we could do a movie," and the studio was like, "Hell yeah."
So the studio saw the. So here's the question for you then. When you say create a tornado on screen, does that mean the same thing as they created a tornado in a studio? Like they actually had wind moving and debris inside of it? Like one of the things that I find that appears very difficult to make look realistic are giant big bodies of water moving when they're using smaller bodies of water to create the effect. You get there's a difference in the fluid dynamics. So
these are the things that I don't notice.
you don't notice that. Well, I would I think there's something to actually seeing the real medium doing its thing versus, but I don't know, CGI has become so amazing nowadays. And then sometimes, like you told me before, it's a combination. So,
Right. No, and this time it is a combination. So they used both visual effects, so digitally created CGI to create the tornadoes, as well as practical effects, things that were done while they were filming. So, for example, so obviously we've talked about the debris that flies around. We see a lot of it in this film. It factors into a lot of dramatic moments. When you see that, there was one of the ways that was created was there was a convoy of trucks that was following the camera truck and the actor vehicles. And as they were filming, they were just shooting debris at them.
Wow.
Yeah. And they used that for some of the extreme weather as well. So there's a hail scene, for example. They had to import the ice from another state and then they chipped it all up. And then they were literally chucking it at the actors. I mean, Bill Paxton has talked about the idea that I was just getting this ice thrown at me. So that stuff they were actually capturing while they were filming.
Yeah.
Then there was stuff that was created via CGI digitally. And then they have to marry what's shot with what's created digitally in a process called compositing. And while the technology for that has greatly, greatly advanced, we're talking 1996. So that took a lot of time, a lot of energy, just painstaking attention to detail. I mean, and it clearly worked well. The movie was nominated for 2 Oscars for Best Sound and Best Visual Effects. It did not win for visual effects. Independence Day won. Apparently, exploding the White House is tough to compete with. But the visual effects were amazing. I wanted to share, there was a funny quote from Steven Spielberg while they were going through the process of creating what this was going to look like. The process of sculpting believable digital funnel clouds, even with the aid of cutting edge technology, took many hours of fine tuning. Snow, meaning Ben Snow, who was a digital effects artist at the time, Snow recalls visual effects producer Kim Bromley Carson dropping a fax on his desk. That sets your time period, right? Spielberg, who called the CG tornadoes astonishing. But Spielberg also added this: the Twister looks a bit like a man who dyes his hair. There's something that's not quite realistic about it. Snow pinned the note above his desk to remind him of how far the team still had to go.
Wow. Great analogy.
I think ultimately one of the reasons this movie is so great and why there's so much love for it, because again, like when I was going down the rabbit hole and doing research for this episode, like people love this movie.
Yeah.
And the effects are a big part of why. But I would also venture to say another reason is because it is anchored by an awesome cast.
There you go.
So you've got Bill Paxton, who plays Bill Harding, the ex-husband and fellow former storm chaser of the character played by Helen Hunt, Dr. Joe Harding. And I'm going to say Dr. Joe Harding a lot because I really want to drive the fact that she is a scientist. And again, like we still need a lot more representation of women scientists on screen. And this goes back to 1996 when there were even fewer of them. So I just want to drive that home. And then you've got this great...
I just got to say this to you. You know, that's something that I've purposely done my entire career. You know, it's in academia, quite often it's on a first name basis, particularly at the top level places, right? If you're at a grad, you know, once you've graduated undergrad, everybody's on a first name basis typically. But, you know, office staff and students will hear people called by their first name, but yet they would still call you doctor because of a respect level, right? But there are certain people for whom that doesn't happen. You get the first name treatment. So I always make sure that in the presence of colleagues and students and everyone, I always address female colleagues as Dr. whatever their name is. Because I saw the trend in real time and I'm like, this is some BS. So I practice it to, you know, be what I want to see happen, right?
I love that. And also like the way, like now I'm laughing because like I hear you say that and what's now playing out in my mind is, oh, that's such great dialogue. Like that's what's happening in the real world, that like when I write a scene now, like that's something that I want to play around with, and that's a dynamic for a scene, and like that's what's really happening. So that's how that processes through my brain. But they give Dr. Joe a really good, strong backstory in this movie. You know, when the movie opens, you actually see a scene where she's a little girl. Her family is caught in unawares by a tornado, and unfortunately, it takes her dad. So she is scarred by this for life. And this is ultimately, you know, what sets her on her life's mission, which is to do research to create better warning systems so people have more time so that they are safe. And, you know, the question becomes like, well, is that enough to create this obsession? And I'm going to say, heck yeah. I mean, honestly, like my mom's dad passed away when she was very young. And, you know, that she carried that with her like her entire life. Like I've witnessed that firsthand. And so when something traumatic like that happens, it can absolutely inform what you do.
There's a great example of that in the world of physics too. There is an annual gravity essay contest for which, you know, Stephen Hawking won 3 times. A buddy of mine came in like 2nd or 3rd one year. You know, the big name physicists, you see them participating in this, but it's all started off just like, you know, Dr. Joe is looking for a cure for tornadoes. This particular person had lost someone due to a fall of some sort and was looking for a cure for gravity. They happen to be wealthy, right? And so at first it became a joke, right? People joked about it, this whole finding a cure for gravity thing. But then it sort of morphed into this very prestigious prize, but it's the same inspiration.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, we're just people who care about things. And in this case, she cares a lot. And the other thing you can tell too, on the flip side of that, is that obviously her character and Bill Paxton's character care a lot about each other. And you never really learn what happened in the interim of like her growing up, them getting together, them getting divorced. You just see them coming back together in this point in time, which is for him, the motivation to go find her is he has a new fiance. Her name is Melissa. She is also a doctor. She is a therapist, a reproductive therapist, which leads to some really fun like moments of humor in the film because of clients that she is counseling over the phone while tornadoes are happening. But that said, you know, so he's come because Joe has not signed their divorce papers yet, and that is what has brought her to him, so he can now go and get married. And I mean, look, it's obvious from the moment they show up together on screen that like, Melissa's not going to be around by the end of the movie. It's totally predictable. And I did not care. I did not care because it's so much fun watching the two of them spar together. And I felt like in their scenes together, you had enough sort of conflict and chemistry and like flirtiness, but also like that I knew all I needed to know about their relationship.
I'm going to just throw this out here for those of you in the audience who may be going through a tough time right now. But what I've seen in life is that breakups typically lead to better lives for all. We treat them at the time like they're tragedy, but I see people go on with their lives and most people thrive post breakup. So if you're going through a breakup right now, you don't need to fly into a twister. You just need a little time.
Don't get your knickers into a twist. You'll eventually find the right person to be with.
Absolutely. And you might find them in a natural disaster.
Hey, there's a lot to be said about the adrenaline that comes up during storms and things.
That's the thing, right? Trauma bonding, excitement bonding.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, like, I don't know if they get together by the end and, will it last? I have no idea, but I will say that I thoroughly enjoyed watching them on screen.
So you've described the story and sort of talked about the construction of the story. Now, this is also a technical evaluation that you do where you think in terms of consistency and, because I could imagine that at a movie like this, which is sort of groundbreaking and revolutionary, what they end up with, where they start, is not where they started. They probably evolved during the whole process of making the movie and somehow have to make it fit into one cohesive picture at the end, right? Once you've now gone through the journey that you had in your mind and on paper, now it's in real audio visual and you pull it all together. Sometimes mistakes are still made, right?
Well, I mean, look, they say, the old adage in filmmaking is that there are 3 movies that you make. There's the movie that you write, there's the movie that you shoot, and there's the movie that you edit. I don't know enough about the origin of this movie to know how much that changed from phase to phase. What I can say is that a bump for me was the final twister scene where they're ostensibly in an F5. Again, as we said before, they wouldn't know it was an F5, but they're calling it an F5. Let's just say it's a really, really, really big storm. And you have Dr. Joe and Bill Paxton's character, and they are hanging on for dear life to this water pipe that's like supposedly buried 30 feet down. They've lashed themselves to it with horse reins as like the building, is ripped off above them. For me, I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. They've said several times throughout the movie that an F5 can have storms. I can have winds up to 250 to 300 miles an hour. Well, maybe that's not enough to rip this like very deeply buried pipe out of the ground. I did have a hard time believing it would not have ripped the two of them off of that pipe and that the horse reins either would have gone or like cut into them and injured them.
Right.
So at that point I was like,
Yeah. I'm with you on that. And that's and not to mention the flying debris. I learned many years ago that the main cause of injury or death from tornadoes is head injuries from flying debris. And there are those sort of videos of some odd object, like a fork in a tree or a wooden plank in a tree. So that didn't fly with me either. The fact that
right.
that
Although
final
you do see injury from debris in this movie, so that is something that they took from real life. So
ain't safe.
No. And we haven't even talked about like the villain, quote unquote villain in this movie or the bad guy played by Cary Elwes, Dr. Jonas, who is basically has ripped off their idea for Dorothy and has a lot of corporate sponsorship. And there's a whole other conversation to be had about like the sort of a thematic thing they talk about is that sort of threads its way through is sort of the instinctive scientist, the person who's doing this because they have a real feel for it versus a character like Cary Elwes, which is doing it for profit. For me as a layperson watching it, I feel like the story that they constructed was enough for me to follow, to feel like I knew storms were increasing. I knew why the barrel wasn't working. I knew why they were having problems deploying it. They came up with a solution that was inspired by something they saw in the story, and I was able to track that as I went. So for me as a viewer, I would say ultimately the story flies
Yes.
because as far as Dorothy goes, I was able to follow that
Yes.
trajectory. The character work, the characters and the actors supported that,
Yeah.
and the visual effects supported it as
Yeah.
well. So if I'm someone like who doesn't know anything about the science of this, what they presented on screen to
Yeah.
me made me go, yeah, I buy into this. I
Yes.
follow this. I get it. You know, there's a lot of jargon that's
Yeah.
tossed around. Some of which is tossed around. I now know is tossed around correctly. Some of which isn't.
Right.
But again, like I felt like I felt like as a viewer, I knew enough to follow and
Yeah.
get the story, and I was into it.
Nice.
So I would say from a story perspective, Dorothy flies. Yeah.
All right. Love it, love it, love it.
So that brings us to
The vibe of Dorothy.
the vibe of Dorothy.
Yeah.
Does it fly for the feels?
Oh my. With a name like Dorothy, it has to fly if there's a tornado involved. So, you know, I love this movie because the science, it was introduced to the viewer in a sort of, I guess, stealthy way, right? So one idea about science. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
One idea about science that I feel that doesn't come through to humanity generally, and also to just understanding truth, is the process of iterating toward perfection. It's not that now this should give you a lot more appreciation for space researchers, because we do get one shot, but for the most part, experimentally, you start off, you improve things as you go, you improve. A great example of that is measuring gravitational waves, right? Which is how we now routinely observe colliding black holes. But for a decade, we saw that they just couldn't reach the sensitivity level to make the measurement. You build the thing and it's doing what it's supposed to do, but it still can't measure what you want it to measure because it's not there yet for whatever reason. And so, for a
Right.
nerd, signal to noise ratio is what you're looking at. You have to have your signal high above your noise. And you're talking about a very, very subtle signal. So that's what they do. They make these subtle advancements on their technology to get better at measuring what you want to measure, versus, the idea of it goes wrong and they pull your funding. So,
Yeah. Yeah. No, and so for me, like kind of refining the question a little bit of like whether Dorothy flies for the feels is we've talked about some things with Dorothy that are scientifically inaccurate.
yep.
We've talked about the fact that the idea of Dorothy has led to work that now actually is scientifically possible.
Mhm.
I guess my question is when you have a movie like this that has scientific inaccuracies, yet over the years has actually been proven to have inspired a lot of people to go into science
Mm.
as a career. It's inspired people to become meteorologists, to become storm chasers, and all of that. Does that fly? Like, is it okay to have a movie that might not be perfectly accurate, but yet inspires people to do work that actually may make things more accurate in real life?
I would say it depends on who you ask, right?
Yeah.
Because, in the world of scientists, it can get very elite snobby.
Is that an official term?
No, I just made that up. But here's what I mean by that. If I write a proposal to get
Mhm.
funding, or if I write a paper about some study I did, there are certain things that you must just include, right? You have to include, for example, all of the background, everything that's ever been said about it and who said it. Okay. And you have to include what are called uncertainties. Where could I go wrong? Like there's something about my instrument I don't understand. There's something about nature I don't understand. And so if you don't point out to whoever's reviewing your paper or your proposal each of these things, all of the history and everywhere it could go wrong, it could just be an easy oversight. They're going to say, this person is an idiot. They do not understand this. Do not fund them. That's how it
Right.
works, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that mindset, some people will look at these movies that have inaccurate
Mhm.
science and they will say, look, this is evidence that they have no idea what the real science is, or how much this is misunderstood in the
Mhm.
world. But being a small part of the ecosystem of making entertainment that's also educational, you know, there are some times where you make sacrifices through analogy, or you just want to be very entertaining in this moment, right? And you sacrifice it. So for me, I don't mind it.
Yeah.
Now, there are certain times where if it sticks in people's heads, like I think one of the biggest accidental injustices has to do with, you know, scientific imagery has to do with the evolution of humanity, going from the knuckle walker to the upright human, right? That's not how it took place, but we all have that in our mind, right? We all have that progression and image in our mind, and it's wrong, right? It's not the way it is.
Yeah.
So in movies, it doesn't typically become something that occupies everyone's mind in terms of, oh yeah, this is the way it works, this is how it happens, right? They don't typically do that.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Although it does often introduce an idea that people will sometimes take with them, again, depending on like how nerdy or not nerdy or you
Yeah.
know, inclined to think about these things that they may think about. I mean, my general thought is that I'm a big believer in the what if, right? Like we're going to create a world, we're going to ask the viewer to come with us on this what if journey. But as somebody who has a lot of respect for all of the STEM fields, my feeling is always, let's make it as accurate as it can be, right? Like if there's not a story reason to change something, then why not have it be accurate? You know, and on this topic, I found there's a piece in the Washington Post by from the I don't know if it's the column is called the Capitol Weather Gang or because it was an older column, but it was written by Catherine Prociv, Prociv, who's a meteorologist and storm chaser. And she was writing about Twister. And she wrote, there are two very different Twister camps among meteorologists. One camp hates and despises the movie due to its glaring inaccuracies and dramatics. The other camp acknowledges the fallacies, pokes fun at the glaring errors, but loves the movie anyway and can recite every line of the movie by heart. Whether meteorologists love or hate the movie, there is no debate that it has been responsible for getting many young people sufficiently interested in weather to pursue a career in meteorology. That is a great thing.
Absolutely.
And I read that and I say, then yeah, it totally flies for the fields because it inspired people. And at the end of the day, it's entertaining, it's inspiring, and it's getting people to do science. Like that flies for me.
That flies for me as well. Yeah, it definitely flies. And you know, I think this whole idea of doing science in the field is really for people to see that. And, you know, in my case, I go, right, so going to observatory mountaintops, that's one thing. But going out to chase total solar eclipses, man, I tell you, I take students out there and they're like, oh, I don't want to know what I'm going to do in my future. And after these adventures, they're like, oh, I'm doing this. This is the bomb.
Well, yeah.
So as far as the vibes and the feels go for me, I agree with you. Twister flies, Dorothy flies.
Still doesn't mean I'm going to get anywhere near a tornado if I can help
I think I would.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, maybe we can end with that question.
Yeah.
If you had the opportunity to go become one of the go with one of the storm chaser crews, would you do it?
I wonder if you could have some sort of extreme sports, you know, tornado, you know, some combination of a wingsuit, a suit of armor, and paragliding.
I think you have just invented a whole new thing. You just have to watch out for the flying cows when you're up in the air, which like, I just have to mention that because it was such an iconic moment on screen.
I gotta go, Julia. We got cows.
But actually, based on research that they did about the fact that farm animals will go up in a funnel.
Yeah, they go with that. It goes up as a cow, comes down as steak. But steak and hamburgers. You can see that.
Well, there's a scene about that in the movie where they're eating at Aunt Meg's, who's played by the amazing actress Lois Smith, who I've had the good fortune to see on doing a lot of theater stuff. She's a Steppenwolf actress. She's amazing. She was amazing. And in her farmhouse, when she's feeding everyone, and they're like,
"Where'd you get all this beef?"
Did you see my cows out front?
No.
Oh.
That's some fast processing. Well, until next week, Tamara, and our friends, nerd out.
Thanks, everyone, for listening and sharing this episode about Twister and Dorothy with us. If you click your heels 3 times and go to Does It Fly Pod on all platforms, you will find out more about the show. We've got on the website, there are definite resources for you if you want to dive more into this topic. And we will see you next Friday with a new show. Thanks, everyone.
Peace.